December 1944. London trembles under a steel-gray sky. The warning sirens wail too late. Without a whisper of engine noise, a V-2 rocket tears through the clouds and slams into the city's heart. A flash of white, a column of fire. A shockwave flattens brick and bone alike. Civilians lie buried in silence before anyone realizes a missile had arrived. There is no defense, no radar detection, no warning, only destruction from stratosphere. These rockets, born in Nazi laboratories, fall faster than sound, carrying terror with scientific precision. The British call them vengeance weapons. In Berlin, German officers stand behind glass walls, watching footage, listening to intercepted panic. Their pride is veiled in cold calculations. This, they believe, is the future of war, a future only Germany can claim. But history had other plans. Fast forward to July 1969. A Saturn V rocket, towering and thunderous, lifts off from Cape Canaveral, roaring toward the heavens. On board, 3 Americans chase humanity's oldest dream, to walk on the moon. And behind this moment, behind the engines, the fuel equations, the multi-stage launch architecture, stands the same man who once brought ruin to London. Wernher von Braun, former SS officer, now architect of the Apollo mission. The world had changed, but the man who built the most terrifying weapon of Hitler's Reich now led the greatest achievement of American science. German officers from the past would never have believed it, but it happened. And it began with a decision at the war's bitter end to capture the enemy's mind before the Soviets could. In the years leading up to World War II, while Europe held its breath under the looming threat of fascism, a quiet revolution in physics and engineering was unfolding in Germany. Among a small group of ambitious visionaries, one name would rise above the rest: Wernher Magnus Maximilian Freiherr von Braun. Born in 1912 to a noble Prussian family, von Braun's fascination with flight began not with war, but with wonder. As a teenager, he dreamed of exploring outer space, inspired by science fiction and early pioneers like Hermann Oberth. Yet, as Hitler consolidated power and rearmed Germany, von Braun's childhood dreams were swept into the engine of a military state that had no interest in peaceful exploration. By 1937, von Braun had been appointed technical director of Germany's Rocket Development Center at Peenemünde, a remote coastal village turned top-secret weapons lab on the Baltic Sea. Here, under the cover of secrecy and under the watchful eye of the SS, von Braun and his team pursued the development of the Aggregat 4 rocket, later renamed the V2, Virgil Tungswaff 2, or Vengeance Weapon 2. It would be the world's first long-range guided ballistic missile, capable of reaching supersonic speeds and striking targets over 300 kilometers away. The science was revolutionary, but the vision had been co-opted. Backed by the full force of the Nazi war machine, Peenemünde became a center of innovation and of moral compromise. The engineers worked with relentless focus, driven by a blend of scientific ambition and nationalistic pressure. Von Braun himself joined the Nazi Party in 1937 and the SS a year later. Whether out of conviction or career necessity, his affiliations would haunt his legacy. His role in the war effort was no longer theoretical. His rockets would soon kill. By 1943, the Allies were fully aware that Germany was developing a powerful new weapon. Intelligence reports from resistance networks and aerial reconnaissance revealed strange installations at Peenemünde. British codebreakers at Bletchley Park, working to decrypt the Enigma machine, intercepted fragmented messages that hinted at rocket tests and devastating new technology. Churchill was deeply alarmed. In August 1943, the Royal Air Force launched Operation Hydra, a nighttime bombing raid on Peenemünde, hoping to cripple the V2 program before it could mature. The attack delayed production, killed over 700 people, and forced much of the work to be moved underground, but it didn't stop it. Von Braun's team, pressured by both time and the Führer's impatience, accelerated their efforts. Tests intensified. Designs were refined. In early 1944, the first successful test launches reached the edge of space, arching silently before crashing back to Earth with explosive force. The physics were unlike anything the world had seen. The V-2 didn't glide or descend. It vanished into the sky, reappeared moments later, and exploded without warning. It broke the sound barrier before impact. No defense system on Earth could stop it. For Germany's military leadership, the rocket represented hope, perhaps their last chance to shift the tide of war. By mid-1944, the Allies had landed in Normandy and were pushing east toward Paris. Berlin was under siege from the sky. The V-2 was meant to be a message. Germany was not yet defeated. But even within Germany's officer corps, there was tension. Some viewed the V-2 as a technological marvel wasted on psychological warfare. Others questioned the cost. Each rocket was immensely expensive and strategically limited. Still, the promise of a miracle weapon kept faith alive within Hitler's inner circle. They believed the rocket would not only terrorize the Allies, but also buy time, perhaps enough to unleash even greater weapons in development. Yet there was a deeper irony taking shape behind the scenes. Even as the rockets fell on London, British and American scientists were studying their remains. Unexploded V-2s were recovered. Their engineering secrets were documented. Every shattered tail fin and twisted fuel line became part of a growing dossier. By 1944, Allied command was no longer asking how to survive the V-2. They were planning how to take it. Because war, brutal as it is, has always valued mines more than missiles. And the man at the center of this storm, Wernher von Braun, was becoming the most valuable mind in Europe. A genius of propulsion, a weapon builder for a collapsing regime, and, soon, a target of the West's most secret intelligence operation. By September 1944, the first V-2 rockets rained down on London and Antwerp with terrifying precision. No sirens warned the public. No planes cast a shadow overhead. Just a split-second whistle, if that, and then a thunderous explosion that leveled homes, hospitals, and schools. Over 3,000 V-2 rockets would be launched before war's end, killing more than 9,000 civilians and military personnel. But the human cost did not end there. Tens of thousands more perished in the rocket's construction, far from the battlefield, deep beneath the earth. After the Piedmont facility was bombed, the V-2 program relocated to the Mittelwerk, an underground tunnel complex carved into the Harz Mountains near Nordhausen. There, under the supervision of the SS, prisoners from the Dora Mittelbau concentration camp were forced to assemble the rockets under brutal, inhumane conditions. Starved, beaten, and worked to death, these laborers, many of them political prisoners, Jews, and Soviet captives, died in such staggering numbers that the Mittelwerk eventually claimed more lives than the V-2 itself. Nearly 20,000 perished in its tunnels. The rocket, hailed by German scientists as a triumph of engineering, had become a machine fed by human suffering. Von Braun visited the site repeatedly. Though he later claimed limited authority over the camp's horrors, records suggest he was aware of the conditions. He saw the emaciated prisoners. He inspected production lines assembled by slave labor. Whether motivated by fear, ambition, or moral detachment, von Braun continued his work, calculating trajectories, refining fuel mixtures, and submitting progress reports to the Reich. His devotion to rocketry remained undeterred, even as the regime that supported him began to fall apart. Meanwhile, the Allies closed in. In early 1945, American, British, and Soviet intelligence agencies were not just fighting over territory, they were preparing for a battle over mines. Whoever captured Germany's scientists would inherit not only their knowledge, but the blueprints to future warfare. This race, often hidden in the footnotes of history, would soon be known as Operation Paperclip. The Americans had grown increasingly interested in von Braun. Reports from double agents and defectors suggested that his team possessed data on guided missiles, supersonic flight, and multi-stage rocket systems, concepts years ahead of Allied capabilities. The Office of Strategic Services, OSS, the forerunner of the CIA, compiled a list of scientists to be secured immediately upon Germany's collapse. Wernher von Braun was at the top, but the Soviets had plans of their own. Stalin's forces were advancing from the east, sweeping through Poland and eastern Germany with brutal speed. They, too, sought von Braun, not to put him on trial, but to put him to work. The Red Army had already captured Peenemund's ruins and several V-2 launch sites. If they found von Braun, they could gain a critical edge in post-war military dominance. The clock was ticking. Von Braun, fully aware of his value, made his move in March 1945. With the Third Reich collapsing around him, he gathered his closest engineers and fled south toward Bavaria. They carried boxes of documents, technical drawings, and even a partially disassembled V-2 rocket. Injured in a car crash during the escape, von Braun arrived at the Austrian border with a broken arm. But his most important asset remained intact: knowledge. On May 2, 1945, as German forces surrendered across Europe, von Braun's group formally surrendered to the 44th Infantry Division of the U.S. Army. It was a stunning turn. Less than a year earlier, his rockets had shattered Allied cities. Now, he was shaking hands with the victors, not as a prisoner, but as a bargaining chip. What followed was not a trial, nor exile, but recruitment. Under heavy secrecy, American intelligence officers, many of them unaware of the full extent of von Braun's Nazi affiliations, interrogated and vetted the scientists. A few were deemed too complicit and were excluded. But most, including von Braun, were quietly approved for relocation. Through Operation Paperclip, over 1,600 German scientists, engineers, and technicians were brought to the United States. They were given new identities, housing, and jobs in government laboratories. Von Braun, along with many of his Peenemund colleagues, was sent to Fort Bliss, Texas, where he began work on guided missile technology for the U.S. Army. The man who had engineered Hitler's vengeance weapon now stood in the American desert, pointing rockets at the sky. The moral lines were blurred. The strategic advantage was clear. The Cold War had begun, and the U.S. was no longer asking what von Braun had done, but what he could do next. The V-2 rocket did not win the war for Germany. It didn't even slow the Allied advance. But tactically, it changed everything. For the first time in military history, a weapon launched from one country could strike another with no warning, no interception, and no engagement of enemy forces. This was not a gunfight. It was a message. War had entered a new phase, one where range and speed replaced trenches and tanks. The Allies quickly realized that defending against the V-2 was impossible. Its supersonic speed meant it struck before any radar could track it. Anti-aircraft guns were useless. Civil defense systems, sirens, shelters, observation balloons were rendered obsolete overnight. While the physical damage was localized compared to strategic bombers, the psychological impact was far greater. Londoners were not afraid of bombers they could hear, but of missiles they couldn't. Each V-2 impact shattered more than buildings. It shook confidence. It undermined the illusion of safety, and it revealed a future where warfare would no longer need armies on the ground. Technologically, the V-2 was a quantum leap forward. It was the world's first ballistic missile, its propulsion system a marvel of engineering. Fueled by a volatile mix of liquid oxygen and ethanol, it could reach an altitude of over 80 kilometers before descending in a high-velocity arc. Its gyroscopic guidance system, primitive by today's standards, was revolutionary for its time. It allowed the rocket to maintain trajectory without human input, paving the way for autonomous missile systems decades later. More critically, the V-2 achieved spaceflight. Briefly, during its arc, the missile crossed the boundary between atmosphere and vacuum. It was, in technical terms, humanity's first object in space. That milestone was not achieved by peaceful scientists in a lab. It was crossed by a weapon falling toward a civilian population. For future generations of engineers, this would become a paradox, that the path to the stars began with a machine built to kill. To German officers and engineers within the Third Reich, the V-2 represented both their finest achievement and their bitterest frustration. On one hand, it was proof that German science still led the world. Despite shortages, bombings, and a losing war, they had created a weapon unlike any seen before. Its successful launch was a moment of pride, captured in black and white films shown privately to the Wehrmacht High Command. But for frontline officers, those serving in the rubble of Eastern Europe or the retreating edges of France, the V-2 was a distant symbol with limited value. It could not stop Patton's tanks. It could not turn back the Red Army. And it drained precious resources, aluminum, copper, and labor, that could have supported more immediate defenses. Some generals argued the rocket was a propaganda stunt, better suited for morale than for battle. Others, particularly within the SS and Hitler's inner circle, saw it as a divine weapon, a futuristic torchbearer of German superiority. That clash between scientific ambition and military practicality defined the final phase of Nazi weapon development. Brilliant designs with little time to matter. Inside Germany's scientific elite, however, a quiet realization took root. The war was lost, but their knowledge, their equations, test data, and experience remained valuable. And if the Allies wanted that knowledge, the price would be survival. Von Braun and his team knew they held a trump card. They had built something no one else on Earth had. Not even the Soviets had matched their advances. That awareness altered their decisions in the war's final months. They preserved documents. They protected prototypes. And they positioned themselves not as loyal Nazis, but as apolitical scientists waiting for their chance to defect. It wasn't treason in their eyes. It was preservation of science, of careers, of futures beyond Germany. Meanwhile, the Allies were watching closely. British intelligence analyzed every V-2 impact crater. American spies tracked rocket test rumors through Swiss and Swedish intermediaries. Even the French resistance smuggled sketches and component names out of occupied areas. The picture became clearer with each passing month. Germany had not only built the most advanced missile in history, it had built the men who understood the future of warfare. And those men would soon no longer belong to Germany. Beneath the technological triumph of the V-2 rocket lay a brutal human cost that often goes unmentioned in sanitized histories. The middlework tunnels, where thousands of V-2s were assembled, were built and operated by prisoners of the Dora-Mittelbau concentration camp. These were not criminals or trained laborers, but victims deemed disposable by the Nazi regime. Under appalling conditions, they worked 16-hour shifts in freezing, damp underground chambers filled with toxic fumes, loud machinery, and collapsing ceilings. They were beaten for resting, starved for falling behind, executed for sabotage, even when the sabotage was imagined. Eyewitness accounts describe workers collapsing beside rocket shells, dying in silence while engineers walked past. It is estimated that for every V-2 launched, more than 6 prisoners died building it. The V-2 program was not just a scientific endeavor. It was a system of death, engineered as much by neglect and cruelty as by chemistry and physics. And yet, when the war ended, few of those responsible for the program's atrocities were held accountable. The Allies faced a stark decision. On one side, justice, trying and convicting those who had overseen slave labor, contributed to civilian massacres, and pledged loyalty to the Nazi state. On the other, strategy, harnessing the minds that had built the world's first space-capable weapon before the Soviets could. The United States chose the latter. In 1945, under Operation Paperclip, the U.S. government deliberately concealed the Nazi affiliations of many German scientists, allowing them to enter the country under sanitized backgrounds. Wernher von Braun, whose SS membership and middlework visits were documented, was classified as a safe asset. Within months, he was working for the U.S. Army, receiving a salary, a lab, and a vision for future rocketry. This was not an isolated compromise. Paperclip brought over 1,600 former Nazi-affiliated scientists to American soil. Some had designed nerve agents. Others had worked on aircraft engines or submarine technology. But the jewel in the crown was the Piedmont team. They were immediately tasked with advancing the U.S. missile program, first for defense, then for space exploration. For the Americans, the Cold War had already begun. The Soviets had seized German rocket parts and captured their own share of scientists. If the United States hesitated, They feared they would lose the technological race that would define the second half of the 20th century. There was no time for moral clarity. Von Braun's transformation from Nazi engineer to American visionary was swift and deliberate. At Fort Bliss, he lectured officers on propulsion mechanics. At White Sands Proving Ground, he oversaw test launches of modified V-2s. His charisma helped. He was articulate, charming, and deeply enthusiastic about space. To many Americans, he was the face of science, not war. He spoke of reaching the moon, of building stations in orbit, of using rockets for peace. The past, it seemed, could be buried under layers of optimism and innovation. By the mid-1950s, von Braun had become a central figure in the burgeoning U.S. space program. He moved to Huntsville, Alabama, where he led the development of the Redstone missile, America's first large-scale ballistic missile. It was the direct descendant of the V-2, improved and refined, but carrying the same DNA. When the Soviets launched Sputnik in 1957, triggering national panic, von Braun's role expanded. He was appointed to head development of launch vehicles for what would become NASA. In 1960, he officially became director of NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center, leading a team that included many of his former German colleagues. Together, they would design the Saturn V, the most powerful rocket ever built, and the one that would carry astronauts to the moon. The irony was staggering. The same mathematical equations that once calculated the fall of rockets on London were now plotting a trajectory to the Sea of Tranquility. The same man who shook hands with Heinrich Himmler was now shaking hands with President John F. Kennedy. Von Braun's past was never erased. It was simply overshadowed by his usefulness. To many Germans, especially those who had survived the war or lost loved ones to Allied bombing raids, von Braun's American reinvention was confusing, even surreal. Some felt betrayed. Others felt vindicated. A few German officers, interviewed in post-war memoirs, expressed disbelief that the United States had not only embraced a former Nazi officer, but had made him a national hero. Their disbelief was not rooted in politics, but in the assumption that America, as a moral force, would never cross that line. They were wrong. And yet, from a purely scientific perspective, von Braun's legacy is monumental. Without his expertise, the United States may not have reached the moon in 1969. His understanding of propulsion, staging, and orbital mechanics accelerated the American space program by at least a decade. For scientists who followed, he was both a mentor and a contradiction, a man who dreamed of the stars while building tools of war. His life became a case study in how progress and power often share the same path, no matter how dark its origins. As the Third Reich collapsed in the spring of 1945, Wernher von Braun stood at a crossroads. The rockets he had built with such obsessive precision now lay silent. The assembly lines had stopped. The launch pads at Peenemünde were abandoned. And in Berlin, Hitler was dead. With the Soviets closing in from the east and the Americans from the west, von Braun knew the war was over, but for him, a new battle had just begun. This time, it was not a battle of bombs, but of value, of which side would capture his mind. In the final weeks of April, von Braun and his closest associates, including Walter Dornberger, Arthur Rudolph, and Magnus von Braun, fled south with a convoy of documents, drawings, and the technical blueprints of the V-2. Injured in a car accident and nursing a broken arm, von Braun was in pain, but his focus remained on the future. The Peenemünde Group had long prepared for this moment. They had chosen to surrender to the Americans, not the Soviets. Not out of political alignment, but because they knew their treatment would likely be better. The Americans wanted the technology, but more importantly, they wanted the men behind it. And von Braun was the centerpiece. The team reached the Bavarian town of Riet, Austria, and made contact with a nearby U.S. military unit, the 44th Infantry Division. On May 2nd, 1945, von Braun officially surrendered to American forces, offering not just his personal expertise, but a carefully prepared package, lists of scientists, locations of hidden V-2 parts, and the knowledge to reconstruct an entire missile program. The Americans were stunned by the depth of detail. Within days, intelligence officer from the U.S. Army Ordnance Corps had arrived. They understood the stakes. The Soviets were hunting the same men. Every hour mattered. What followed was one of the most secretive and controversial operations of the post-war era, Operation Paperclip. Named for the paperclips attached to the files of approved scientists, it was designed to extract Germany's most advanced minds and relocate them to the United States. At first, the plan faced resistance within the U.S. government. Many of the scientists had documented affiliations with the Nazi Party, the SS, or had worked in facilities using slave labor. By law, they were to be excluded from entry into the U.S. But the military, and particularly the Army's Rocket Development Division, pushed back. The Soviet Union was already collecting its own pool of German scientists. If the United States delayed, it would fall behind in the coming technological race. The moral compromises, some argued, could be made later. The knowledge could not wait. Von Braun was moved quickly, first to a detention facility in Paris for debriefing, then to a U.S. military base in Germany. His answers were calculated, calm, and precise. He emphasized his scientific motivations, downplayed his Nazi affiliations, and distanced himself from the horrors of middle work. In one report, he stated, "My allegiance has always been to science, not politics." To the interrogators, many of whom lacked technical backgrounds, it was enough. Von Braun, despite being an SS officer, was deemed safe for transfer. He was flown to the United States in late 1945, along with around 120 members of his team. They arrived at Fort Bliss, Texas, under a cloud of secrecy. Officially, they were technical specialists on temporary military assignment. Their families were housed in guarded compounds. Their movements were restricted, but their work began immediately. The U.S. Army tasked them with reverse engineering the V-2, adapting it for American use, and drafting blueprints for next-generation ballistic missiles. Von Braun found himself in familiar surroundings, labs, blueprints, engineering meetings. Only now, the swastikas were gone, replaced by stars and stripes. To the public, little was known. The average American had no idea that former Nazi officers were now working for the U.S. military. Even within government circles, Operation Paperclip was classified at the highest levels. But to those inside the program, Von Braun was already being seen not as a prisoner, but as a partner. His charm helped. He was fluent in English, articulate, and surprisingly charismatic. He gave lectures, wrote internal memos about interplanetary travel, and even suggested ideas for space stations. Slowly, his image began to shift from rocket engineer of the Reich to prophet of the space age. Behind the scenes, debates still raged. The State Department, responsible for immigration vetting, continued to raise concerns about von Braun's Nazi past. But the War Department, now focused on Cold War threats, overruled them. The logic was cold, but clear. Von Braun's mind was too valuable to let go. He had built the world's first ballistic missile. Now, he would build America's future in space. What the public did not yet know was that this quiet transfer of enemy scientists would spark an arms race, accelerate the space program, and shape decades of military and scientific advancement. The line between enemy and ally had blurred. The man who once built weapons for Hitler was now sketching rockets that would one day lift astronauts into orbit. The transformation of Wernher von Braun from a Nazi weapons engineer to America's most celebrated rocket scientist did not happen overnight. It was a process shaped by geopolitics, public relations, and a nation's hunger for supremacy in the skies. Throughout the late 1940s and early 1950s, von Braun remained a figure confined to military laboratories, working on American ballistic missile programs. But it was not until the Soviet Union launched Sputnik in October 1957 that the U.S. government truly unleashed his potential. That single beeping satellite orbiting above Earth's atmosphere triggered a national panic. Suddenly, America wasn't just in a Cold War, it was in a space race. And Wernher von Braun became its reluctant champion. President Dwight D. Eisenhower, pressured by public outcry and political urgency, authorized the creation of a civilian space agency, NASA, in 1958. von Braun, still working with the U.S. Army's Missile Development Team in Huntsville, Alabama, was swiftly transferred into the new agency's ranks. There, he and his German-born colleagues formed the core of NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center, tasked with designing launch vehicles that could carry payloads, and eventually people, into orbit. It was a bold assignment. The U.S. had only managed a few suborbital flights. The Soviets had already put a man in space. Von Braun now carried the weight of national expectations on his shoulders. The answer came in the form of the Saturn V, a rocket that would dwarf anything ever built. Standing over 360 feet tall, powered by 5 F-1 engines in its first stage alone, and capable of generating 7.5 million pounds of thrust, the Saturn V was a direct descendant of the V-2. The principles were the same: multi-stage flight, precise guidance systems, and massive propulsion. But the scale had changed. This was no longer a weapon. It was a launch vehicle designed to lift a human crew beyond Earth's gravity, through the void, and to another celestial body. Von Braun led the engineering effort with intensity and vision. He held long meetings, obsessing over fuel efficiency, engine burn rates, structural loads, and failure modes. He clashed with colleagues, pushed deadlines, and personally reviewed thousands of design documents. To the public, he became the face of NASA's rocket development, the German genius turned American patriot. He appeared on television, gave lectures, and even collaborated with Walt Disney to explain spaceflight to a curious American audience. His heavy accent became familiar. His past faded behind white lab coats and glossy promotional films. And then, in July 1969, it happened. On the morning of July 16th, the Saturn V stood upright on Launch Pad 39A at Kennedy Space Center. A thick fog of cryogenic vapor rolled off its massive body. Inside, astronauts Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins waited in silence. At 9:32 a.m., the engines ignited, and the rocket slowly lifted from the Earth. It rose with a sound that shook the ground for miles, its bright flame piercing the Florida sky. Within 12 minutes, it had entered Earth orbit. Hours later, it was en route to the moon. 4 days later, Armstrong's boots touched lunar dust. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. But in the shadows of that triumph stood a complicated legacy. The rocket that had carried America to the moon bore the fingerprint of a man who once answered to Hitler. A man whose early designs had devastated European cities. A man who had once overseen rocket construction while thousands of prisoners died in underground tunnels. German officers who had survived the war watched the moon landing in stunned silence. Some with admiration, others with disbelief. Many had assumed von Braun would be tried, imprisoned, or perhaps erased from public memory. Instead, he was being celebrated, an immigrant success story, a wartime compromise turned peacetime hero. American newspapers hailed him as the genius behind the moonshot. His Nazi past, though never entirely forgotten, was compartmentalized. A footnote, a necessary evil in the pursuit of a greater good. For von Braun, the moon landing was not just a scientific victory, it was a personal redemption. It proved that the rocket, once a symbol of destruction, could become an instrument of exploration. That the same knowledge used to wage war could also expand the boundaries of human experience. But even he could not escape the questions. In interviews, he was careful. He expressed regret for the war, for the suffering, but always framed himself as a scientist caught in politics, not a perpetrator of them. "I was interested in the rocket," he once said. "Whether it went up or down, I didn't care." That quote, perhaps more than any, revealed the paradox of Wernher von Braun. He was not a villain, nor a saint. He was an engineer, a visionary, and a man who, for better or worse, embodied the strange bargain of modern history, where the line between science and morality is often drawn only in hindsight. As the dust settled across post-war Europe, Germany began the long process of reckoning with its past. Cities were in ruins, its military defeated, its government dismantled. But perhaps the deepest wounds were not physical, but moral. The Nuremberg trials, convened in late 1945, sought to bring justice to those who had planned and executed the horrors of the Nazi regime. 24 major political and military leaders were tried, along with thousands of lower-ranking officials. Crimes against humanity, war crimes, genocide, the language of justice was created to name what had been done. And yet, amid this historic pursuit of accountability, many of the men responsible for Nazi Germany's most advanced and deadly technologies were absent from the courtroom. Wernher von Braun, despite his SS membership, despite his role at Mittelwerk, despite his knowledge of forced labor, was never summoned to Nuremberg, nor were most of his colleagues. Their names did not appear in indictments. Their crimes, if acknowledged at all, were weighed against their strategic value to the West. The same nation that helped define the principles of justice in Nuremberg had quietly moved those scientists to safety before the trials even began. In Germany, this omission was not lost on the public. Survivors of the Dora-Mittelbau concentration camp spoke out. Some testified to seeing von Braun walk through the tunnels, observing the laborers as they worked under threat of death. Others described being beaten or starved under supervisors reporting directly to engineers. But without legal action, their stories faded into the shadows. Von Braun's role became a contested memory. In West Germany, where the political focus shifted quickly to economic recovery and Cold War alignment with the United States, there was little appetite to question a man now celebrated in American newsreels. In East Germany, under Soviet control, von Braun was vilified as a traitor, a genius who abandoned his homeland to serve capitalist propaganda. But even there, his name carried a grudging respect. The deeper moral issue ran far beyond one man. It cut to the heart of a question that still haunts modern warfare. Can scientific progress be separated from the means by which it is achieved? The V-2 rocket, hailed as a technological marvel, was built on the backs of thousands who died in silence. Their names were not remembered in textbooks. Their stories did not appear in space documentaries. The Mittelwerk tunnels, sealed for years after the war, were eventually reopened and investigated. Human remains were found. Skeletal evidence of a death camp disguised as a factory. A place where science advanced even as humanity regressed. In the years that followed, West Germany would begin the slow process of acknowledging this dark chapter. Memorials were constructed at the site of Dora-Mittelbau. Testimonies from survivors were collected and archived, but the question of accountability remained largely unanswered. The engineers were gone. Most had taken American citizenship, built lives in Texas, Alabama, and California. They were no longer seen as Germans. They were former Germans, a legal distinction that created moral distance from the past. And so, for many in Germany, the moon landing in 1969 was a moment of pride tinged with unease. It proved that their country had produced minds capable of greatness, but also minds that had chosen collaboration over conscience. The rocket that lifted Armstrong and Aldrin into history had been born in a bunker, designed for war, tested in silence. And yet, in the eyes of millions, it now symbolized peace. That paradox was never easy to resolve, nor was it intended to be. The geopolitical needs of the Cold War demanded victory in every domain: land, sea, air, and space. In that pursuit, the moral compromises of the past were often buried beneath layers of secrecy and patriotism. The silence of justice was not an oversight. It was a choice. In the United States, the narrative around Wernher von Braun was carefully managed. During the 1950s and 60s, as Cold War tensions escalated, the government, media, and aerospace industry crafted a public image that celebrated him not as a former Nazi, but as a brilliant immigrant engineer who had embraced American ideals. Magazine covers portrayed him smiling in front of rocket blueprints. Newsreels showed him explaining complex scientific principles in plain English. Schoolchildren read about his dream of colonizing Mars. In many ways, he became the face of American optimism, proof that science, harnessed correctly, could lead humanity toward stars. NASA's success further cemented this image. The Mercury and Gemini programs laid the groundwork, But it was the Apollo missions that truly enshrined von Braun in the American consciousness. The Saturn V was not just a machine. It was a symbol of progress, triumph, and national will. It stood against the backdrop of a turbulent decade marked by civil rights struggles, the Vietnam War, and political assassinations. Amid the chaos, space exploration offered a unifying vision. And at the center of that vision was a man whose past had been selectively erased. Von Braun played his part well. He spoke passionately about science education, the future of space colonies, and the importance of international cooperation. He became a U.S. citizen in 1955 and later received numerous honors, including the National Medal of Science. Few question his background. Those who did, journalists, historians, or Holocaust survivors, were often dismissed as critics trying to politicize a technical achievement. In the eyes of many Americans, the moon landing had earned him a clean slate. But history does not forget so easily. In the decades following his retirement, and especially after his death in 1977, a more critical lens began to emerge. Declassified documents, survivor testimonies, and newly discovered evidence painted a fuller picture, one that included complicity, silence, and strategic amnesia. Historians debated the moral trade-offs of Operation Paperclip. Was it right to protect and reward men who had contributed to the Nazi war machine? Could the ends, landing on the moon, justify the means? The U.S. government eventually acknowledged the ethical complexities. In later years, formal reports were released detailing the scope of Paperclip and the Nazi affiliations of those brought over. Memorials to the victims of Mittelbau-Dora were visited by American dignitaries. The rocket that had once been a tool of vengeance was now framed within a broader historical context, one that recognized both its achievements and its origins. Still, for the average citizen, the legacy remained mixed. In Huntsville, Alabama, where von Braun had led NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center, a statue still stands. Streets are named after him. Schools bear his name. And yet, museum plaques now include references to his early affiliations, the use of forced labor, and the moral questions his life raises. The silence has broken, but not been fully reconciled. For Germany, the story came full circle in a different way. The nation that once sought to dominate the world through technological superiority had, in the post-war era, become a leader in confronting historical truth. Germany's remembrance culture, its commitment to acknowledging the crimes of its past, extended even to figures like von Braun. While his scientific legacy is noted, it is always accompanied by the facts of middle work, the SS, and the people who suffered beneath the rockets he built. In the end, Wernher von Braun's story is not just about science or war. It is about the choices societies make when confronted with genius forged in darkness. It is about the uncomfortable truths that lie behind great achievements. And it is about the cost of forgetting, even when the sky is lit with the glow of a rocket's flame. Wernher von Braun's journey, from the ruins of Nazi Germany to the lunar surface, stands as one of the most extraordinary arcs in modern history. It is a story of redemption wrapped in denial, of brilliance entangled with moral failure. His rockets changed the world. First, by striking fear into its cities. Then by lifting its dreams into the stars. And yet, at the heart of this transformation lies an unresolved tension. Can we separate the scientist from the system he served? The V-2 rocket was more than a weapon. It was a threshold. It marked the beginning of an age where humanity could escape its own gravity, where our species could imagine itself not just as inhabitants of Earth, but as explorers of the universe. But that path to the stars was paved with silence, with decisions made in the shadows, with victims whose voices were lost beneath the roar of engines and the applause of televised triumphs. Von Braun never stood trial. He never publicly accounted for the laborers who died building his dreams. History, for a time, allowed him to pivot unchallenged from a servant of one regime to a symbol of another. But time has sharpened the questions. What is the price of progress when it's built on the backs of the forgotten? How do we honor scientific achievement without ignoring its human toll? Perhaps the story of Wernher von Braun is not one of absolution, but of caution. It reminds us that science does not exist in a vacuum, that every equation, every blueprint, every technological leap is shaped by the values of the world it serves. And when that world forgets to ask how, and at what cost, then even our greatest triumphs carry the weight of the past. The rocket rose, the moon was reached, but the shadow of its origin will always follow its trail.